Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour. It's 8 p.m. On Friday the 31st of January 2020. In 3 hours, we will leave the European Union. This, of course, is 3.5 years after the Brexit referendum and a hell of a lot of political wrangling. One hung parliament and one catastrophic defeat for the Labour Party. But anyway, to talk about the last 3 years and what comes next, I am joined by two columnists who've both been quite vocal about the Brexit process and coming from different directions, which always makes for a lively show. I have Grace Blakeley, economist and columnist at Tribune.
Yes.
How are you doing?
I'm so good. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you feeling?
I don't know why I said I was so good.
Are
I
you
just
feeling
feel
resigned,
I'm just
celebrating?
nice.
You were Lexity,
you
weren't
know what? I haven't even. I don't know. Like today has come and gone without any particular acknowledgement of anything because it's. I mean, it's sure. I was Lexity, but this is terrible. Everything's terrible.
Oh, shit. Mike Galsworthy. Yeah. Sorry, founder of Scientists
for EU,
Scientists
NHS
for EU.
for People's Vote.
All these front organisations you trying to
March
overturn the result.
I've actually got four that I helped spin out.
So what were the four? Scientists for the EU. NHS for People's Vote.
NHS for People's Vote, which was previously NHS Against Brexit, which was previously Healthier In.
Yeah.
March for Change, which was something of a spin out in People's Vote. We could talk about that later if you're really interested about the history of People's Vote.
Actually, genuinely am.
Oh God, there's stories there, right?
I literally can't wait to hear them all.
I'm going to need more alcohol for that. And then our social media intelligence unit, which I set up with colleagues, including in the States where we've got some machines, and we've been studying lots of social media dynamics, including actually the Labour leadership contest as well.
And what have you learned?
So what
kind of insights have you got from that?
You're going to have so much more to say than any of the rest of us.
Well, it's quite fun to build dashboards for and against each of the candidates. So, for example, for Keir against Keir, for Becky against Becky, where you find tweets that are for them, find tweets that are against them, then you hoover off all the people that are retweeting them. That's your community that you can then live study.
That's
interesting. So you can see who is that community. Who do they look to? Like, who are they all following?
Yeah.
But you can also watch them on live dashboards to see what they're interested in talking about.
Imagine if the Labour Party was this competent.
Well, I want to get this.
Imagine if, like, Momentum was this competent.
This into the Labour Party. So, with all teams, it doesn't matter as long as they're aware of themselves, right, and what the dynamics around them are, but also what I want to do is study what is the external conversation around Keir and Lisa and Becky and Emily, particularly the leading candidates. What are the right-wing press pushing out and what are the Tories pushing out? Because they were very competent with dark network advertising during the general election just gone, and we saw that. And we monitored that. So I want to get these kind of understandings into Labour now that PV has fallen apart and I've got this spare capacity.
PV fell apart quite dramatically, didn't it?
Yeah, we all want to hear the stories.
Yeah, have you got the gossip of what happened? Because I suppose
we heard a lot from the internet.
We're going to talk more in detail about the Labour leadership afterwards because I think you're coming from different
episode?
perspectives. But I suppose just in short, right? Because one, I was expecting the People's Vote campaign to be a bit more active during the general election, and two, I was especially expecting them to be active in the Labour leadership election because I thought they'd be running a huge entryist campaign for Jess Phillips to make her become the leader of the Labour Party.
Really?
There
Starmer?
was some of that. No, it was those that walked out of the People's Vote campaign and all that fiery exit. They decamped into the Jess Phillips campaign. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a bunch of sort of like Blairite professionals. Obviously,
why would
I
they not
presume
be
now
supporting Starmer?
Well, because Jess Phillips Starmer was seen as, an independent man. He was in the shadow cabinet.
Starmer was like the voice of Remain for the last 4 years.
As we were doing all of our PV meetings, Keir never came to those. He was
Didn't
independent,
come to
and he was.
That is what makes him a bad socialist.
Well, he didn't go to second referendum meetings. That should be a plus.
But he was in there in the Labour front bench, and so that's where he was. Whereas Jess Phillips was oftentimes in the People's Vote meetings.
Because you didn't have anything else to do.
Network. Well, there we go,
Yeah. Other than talk to the Times and do photo shoots.
Let's do a bit of a People's Vote retrospective, I suppose. So, the argument that many people on the left are making, I kind of subscribe to it to put my cards on the table. was that the People's
Saw
Vote
this
campaign.
coming.
Yeah. I mean, we're not
I'm
here
gonna
to
gang
attack
up
you,
on
but the People's Vote campaign, they polarized
Fair
opinion.
dues,
They
yeah.
created a big, or they made a huge gamble where they said there's only two options. One is a sort of Tory hard Brexit, and one is Remain, and they lost. And what the People's Vote campaign made impossible was a kind of soft Brexit agreement between potentially, Labour soft Brexiters and Theresa May. Do you think that ultimately the campaign, while successful at getting people out on the streets, has given us a harder Brexit than we would otherwise have had?
I've been thinking a lot on that, because there was a moment when Theresa May's deal was offered up. We were all out in Parliament Square on a People's Vote event, to say, yeah, let's vote it down. And the ERG were wanting to vote it down as well. And then they did by a massive margin, and we all celebrated. And I thought, yay, but we are collectively with the ERG torching the middle ground here. And so it's increasing the stakes on both sides. Are we going to win? Do we actually have the competence on our side to match those very, very dedicated people that have their hands round the throat of government? And I didn't know, but I recognised that it was a gamble. My thinking was actually that if we had gone with that, then we would have never known if we could have got rid of it entirely. And if we'd gone with, to explain more clearly, if we'd gone with Theresa May's deal, then we know that the ERG and the hard Brexiteers would have always been saying that they were sold out, and then make it progressively harder. And we know that that would have involved also Labour sort of backing that deal, which means that if it went badly, Labour were tarnished with the same brush. And so, it was a gamble. And I think sometimes in life, you have to go with where your heart is. And, and I think by that stage I was thinking, this isn't a single market project. We're not going to be a third pillar in the single market that can move closer or move further away by sensible steps. This is something that is always going to be hijacked by the extremists until they get what they want. If we can bring any deal that they bring forward to just a public vote, then we do have the opportunity to vote on those specifics and maybe, clear it off the table.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be a vulgar materialist, but I feel like the best start to every sentence. I feel like analysing the who was behind, like the most, the biggest political forces behind the parts of the People's Vote campaign, plus where the money was coming from, plus the massive support that was generated from various sections of the media and, the liberal establishment more generally. I would have thought that it would have been slightly more obvious than maybe it was to a lot of people involved in the campaign that this was not just about achieving the best possible Brexit conceivable. There was obviously a political project that was associated with it that was about reviving, centrism, for lack of a better word, liberalism in the context of its the decline of the centre as politics, as polarised, and, with the failure of capitalism over the last 10 years to provide a basic standard of living for the majority of people.
Quick history of People's Vote campaign then. And that is that after the referendum, lots of people were fucked off. Can we
You can swear on this one, yeah.
freely
We
here?
can, yeah.
Really fucked off with Britain Stronger in Europe. Because they had repressed all of these different grassroots campaigns, both regional and sectoral and associated with different demographics, whereas Vote Leave and Leave.eu had actually celebrated little campaigns and got behind them and pushed them forward. So after Britain Stronger in Europe died off, there was this blooming of all these other campaigns, and my campaigns became more prominent as well. But it wasn't having media cut through at the end of 2016 and 2017 as they were all growing. And so, and certainly the BBC had decided that this was never going to be that anyone should interfere at all with Brexit. So then the idea behind the People's Vote campaign was firstly, let's get together to have enough critical mass in order to get through to the BBC, to raise funds and to help each other, because we were small campaigns. And that was in about March 2018. However, when we did come together, it was pretty much taken over fairly quickly by Open Britain, which was the legacy campaign from Britain Stronger in Europe. And so we decided not to have governance. So I contributed my two campaigns to the umbrella of People's Vote. But with Open Britain, with our campaigns, we decided not to have a governance structure because basically we thought, we are on a very slim chance of actually getting anywhere here. So we're not going to have all these endless board meetings that we'd had before about trying to bring different campaigns together. We're just going to work together. So Open Britain sort of set up the crowdfunder and set up the email database and then decided that as we were all promoting those and they were collecting the emails and they were collecting the money, that they weren't going to share it back. And that came fairly early on.
Another Labour Party organising 101. Whoever has the data has the power.
Yeah. So,
well, except they haven't done much of it, eh?
No, that's true.
Yeah. So
what they will do with it, that's the
they were going to use it for the Jess Phillips campaign, but then everyone fell out.
Well, no, because they didn't have control of it by then, because they had actually been kicked out.
Because it's Roland Rudd who now has the emails.
So it's the board. So it wasn't just Roland that kicked them out. So this is the Alistair Campbell
can you tell us
story.
this whole story?
We need the factions.
Yeah, this is the thing I'm most interested in. I'm not going to lie.
Okay. So I'll continue from where I was before.
Please do. We won't interrupt you anymore.
So that causes some sort of tense dynamics because as Open Britain grew, then it also linked in Tom Baldwin, who was brought in as from the joint media unit, which was set up, and then he linked in Alistair Campbell. And then there were links there with Blair, and we were saying, please don't put Alistair and Blair up. Remember, we had these conversations last time, and I actually got a shitload of grief for actually even saying that to you guys. So anyway, that was building up, and it was causing tensions in other parts of the campaign. By the time, but we kind of kept that quiet, even though there was lots of fisticuffs behind the scene, because if that blew up, then it would be all over the media that it blew up, and then a chance. So we just had to swallow it. But then by the time we got to the European elections, right, things changed. The Lib Dems surged, right, and the Brexit Party surged, and that meant that Labour had to take a change of tack, and it meant that the Conservative Party had to change tack. And we at the People's Vote campaign was still saying we demand a People's Vote, and and there was no involvement of the grassroots. They weren't getting any of the money, they weren't getting any of the local data, they were getting frustrated. They wanted to be making Remain narratives, particularly in those areas where they felt starved out, like in the Labour heartlands, where they thought we need to turn this demographic around. And me and others agreed that in those areas, in order to have the Labour MPs secure that they could actually come off the side of the fence onto where it looked like things were going, you needed stronger grassroots there. So we tried to go more pro-Remain with messages that actually worked there. We wanted to have that shift and say, you guys at PV, Central, shall we say, that have decided to take over the system and keep us excluded. Keep doing that with the Conservative MPs, that's totally fine. But let us do this outrider campaign, which is about Remain and grassroots and building up the grassroots, right? That's when we did our March for Change thing. That's when they went mental internally.
Right.
Absolutely mental with us. So we tried to get Roland Rudd and the board to understand what we were doing. Roland got it. And he was saying to the leadership of BV, just do an email out to promote what they're doing. They wouldn't.
Wow.
They tried to kill off our backers,
and so
all that kind of stuff.
The people opposing you is the Alistair Campbell, Tom Baldwin faction.
Yeah.
So you were actually on side with the Roland Rudd faction.
Roland Rudd was more on side with us, but then it became between them, and we just sat back and watched as it just went.
Wow.
And so, what was the disagreement between? Why did the Roland Rudd faction and the Alistair Campbell, Tom Baldwin faction fall out?
Presumably because the Campbell faction was all about just bringing down Corbyn.
Well, because it was about control, right? So before we make accusations about like who wanted what on camera. But seriously, the board of People's Vote campaign were very disenchanted with Baldwin and McGrory, who were running it, because they were pretty much doing their own thing and not listening to the board, and there were disagreements there. And there was also disagreements about how we sort out the governance. So there was one external thing that was promoted by Alistair Campbell and others that wanted to take over the overall governance structure, and Roland Rudd was like, well, I'm not having that usurp me. Let's do it this way, also involving the grassroots. And then that was the battle. And the CEO and director of comms of People's Vote were with the external one rather than the one of their own board.
Right.
So that was that tension. And then the briefings started happening in the press. And so the evening that Baldwin and McGrory were fired by the Open Britain board, that morning, that Sunday, it had already been in the press that the People's Vote campaign was an open civil war. And so it's kind of like, well, if you run the board, either you sack these two or you say, I fold and they can take over. So it was basically pushed to that point. And then that's when it really exploded, because then Baldwin and McGrory didn't sort of like go quietly and tell the staff, look, this between us and the board, you keep working. They had actually developed their support network from the staff. It had actually ostracized other staff, like the field staff that work with the grassroots. But anyway, they were the ones that walked out with them. And then the rest of the palaver is sort of well documented from the side of the camp that walked out. So then that meant that during the general election campaign, you had those that had walked out saying, you know, we're not going to come back in unless, you know, Tom and James are back in. And then, but they were also controlling the Twitter account for a while and not allowing access to the bank accounts of the People's Vote campaign. So you had those that were left behind trying to run a campaign but feeling very much under siege, and those that had left still on the payroll but not working because they thought that they could leverage them coming back with the bosses that they wanted. And this is while the general election was running.
Sounds
anyway,
toxic as hell.
So I stayed a million miles away from that, and I raised money in order to campaign in the Labour Tory marginals in the Northern Heartlands on issues of NHS and Donald Trump and NHS and the Tories' record on the NHS, because I thought tactical voting alone isn't going to do it. This, from the polling I'd done, seems to be the weak spot, and it's in the Labour Tory marginals in the north where it's really, really dicey. So that's what I did.
What proportion
so you
of the
had the right line.
Yes.
Everyone in retrospect has the right line.
No, but it's on record that that's what I did.
Yeah,
you know,
no.
I can
What
say,
proportion of the People's Vote leadership do you think will be, you know, pretty relaxed today about leaving the European Union because they got their number one job done, which was to destroy Corbynism?
No, I think everyone who was actually in the People's Vote campaign genuinely cared about the issue. But I think that, some people who no longer control the finance and the database are very clearly very angry that what they had built up, they have now been ripped away from, and they don't have that anymore.
Let's look at how some of the top People's Vote people have dealt with today. Well, this was earlier in the week. So we've got...
over to top me up.
We're going to look at... so this was the story that the government have created a new 50p piece to commemorate Brexit. Some of the top Europhiles are not particularly happy. Andrew Adonis tweeted, "I am never using or accepting this coin." The coin says peace, prosperity and friendship with all nations. And then has the date at which time Brexit is going to go. Alistair Campbell has tweeted, "I for one shall be asking shopkeepers for two 20p pieces and a 10 if they offer me a 50p coin pretending that Brexit is about peace, prosperity and friendship with all nations, given it puts all three at risk. If they insist, I will be channeling this man." And then the video is a guy saying fuck off lots of times. Is it a little bit embarrassing that we let these guys...
remotely excited or incensed about this is... either playing a very clever political game where they are deliberately playing up the significance of this particular thing in order to distract from the substance of what's going on, or their brains have literally been melted by Brexit. Like, there is no reason to talk about this as a thing.
Yeah, I have a little story associated with this, which is I was trying to stay out of this
What, the 50p beef?
The debacle over the
it's
50p's.
It's like, I was staying out of this until I saw someone tweet at me that everyone should collect these coins and save them up, then give them to me for a rejoin campaign.
Oh, God.
So then I quote tweeted that and said, well, I think that sounds like a fantastic idea. Everyone get collecting, isn't that a funny idea? And that tweet did particularly well. And then, so I got a call from the Daily Mail and Andrew Pierce that wanted me sort of like on the show to talk about this, right? So I said, okay, yeah, why not? And essentially, he hit me with the same sort of tweets that you hit me, and I just said, listen, if that's what Michael Heseltine's saying, then he's real misery guts. And he went, oh, well said. and I said, yeah, I mean, I'm really disinterested. By the way, this is your week. To all Brexiteers, have a great week. It's been a long time coming. I hope you enjoy it. I've got nothing against all of you. He seemed quite surprised by all of this, and I was probably starting to wonder why I was on the show. And then...
Were you being paid?
No, I mean...
That was, your first mistake. If you're going to go on and talk about trivialities, at least make sure they're lining your pockets.
But I then used it as an excuse to say, what I think sensible people do get bothered by is the fact that these coins were all minted, then smelted down to whatever cost, then reminted, and then we had that £100 million campaign for Get Ready for Brexit, which only took 4 million people onto the website, so 25 quid a hit. Then there's 120 million Festival of Brexit. Then there was the 87 million for the Brexit ferries run by food companies that had never run ferries before. Don't you think that this is all a bit of a waste of money, all in the celebratory part of it, when frankly all of this is costing us vast amounts of money in terms of structural stuff that you're not adequately dealing with?
Well, to be fair, the actual number of 50p pieces is going to be a vanishingly tiny part of the money supply. Like even just the monetary base, which is just cash as a proportion of the money supply, is tiny. This number of things, there'll be, because money circulates quickly, there'll be not very many of them, but the chances of you seeing one at some point might be relatively high depending on how much you use cash. So it's really probably not that much of a high investment, but...
That's what I'm counting on. There are 3 million of them, so that's 1.5 million. If any of you come across any, save it up for me.
Let's do very quickly. I want to ask you if there's going to be a rejoin campaign. First of all, you're watching Tisky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. So please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Also, make sure you subscribe to this channel. As you know, these shows are going out more and more often at the moment. You want to click on the button that says updates, or what is it, notifications, and that means that every time we go live, you'll get a little message, and then you can come watch us. I want to know, is there going to be a rejoin campaign?
I mean, I'm not best placed to answer that.
Mike,
but
are all these 50p's going to go to some...
me.
Do you want it to happen?
Rejoin, yeah. But not in a hurry. I mean, I think there's clearly lots and lots and lots of stuff that we need to sort out domestically first, in terms of our politics, in terms of our structure, in terms of how we relate with other nations. I think we're all going through something of a traumatic period at the moment. I mean, I'm sure Brexiteers think that, it's great now, but I mean, we've got a few years coming up. What proportion
of the public do you think are traumatized? Because I feel like there was this big idea, say, before the election, and when sort of, it wasn't 1 million people, when, half a million people or whatever were walking along the streets, that suddenly this had become this huge culture war that everyone felt incredibly existential about. But now I feel like now it's happening. Everyone's just like, actually, maybe it wasn't that big a deal after all.
I mean, yeah.
I think I'm just more knackered out. I'm absolutely flat knackered from, yeah.
How worried are you about a rejoin movement, Grace? Because, I mean, it has the potential to split the progressive vote, potentially. I don't think that the European Union will survive
in its current form long enough for a rejoin campaign to make itself a viable political force.
Well, it might want to start next year.
I guess.
Well, I mean...
no. That would be unrealistic. And also, fear not, I don't think we're going to be throwing that into a Labour manifesto in a hurry. I think
Well, if you get Keir Starmer, then you might.
That's what I'm counting on. No, but more seriously, essentially, from this point where we have this blank slate, we've massively pressed the reset button in many ways, and the Tories are in control, having pressed this reset button. There's a big question of whether we are now aligning more towards the US, Trump style, where you're going for the populist right-wing stuff, which actually borrows some of the left-wing stuff, but also in terms of all the rights and standards that we care about, that gets trashed, or whether, having done this thing which was cathartic for many, we actually find our country aligning with Europe, where we want to keep improving those standards in terms of quality of life, and progressive values with regard to climate change and so forth.
Soft
and so
Brexit
on.
campaign, that's what you always should have run, in my view. So let's close for alignment. I want to talk actually.
Says the soft
What's
lefty.
relevant is
was
what
a
comes
joke.
next, trade deals. So I wanted to bring up this article that was in The Guardian today. Kim Darroch, who was the UK ambassador to the US until it got leaked that he had, what he said about Trump? I mean, he said something insulting about him. Can't remember exactly what. I think he might have called him dumb. But this is what he's told The Guardian. I know what the US will be pitching for when they negotiate a free trade deal with us. They will pitch for massively greater access for agricultural products. People talk about chlorinated chicken. It is a lot more than that. Farmers in America vote for Trump. Pretty much all of them vote for Trump. They also want us to pay the same for American pharmaceuticals as they pay in their own market. Do they want us to pay more for their pharmaceuticals? Do the companies want to use this? Do the pharmaceutical companies want to use this leverage? Of course they do. Grace, how big a threat is this?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's all basically true.
They want it, though. But what? How likely are the government to accede to those demands?
So what, the British government?
Yeah, the British government to
have a
accede to
choice.
those. Go on, explain.
Well, I mean, so if the UK gets some sort of Canada-style agreement with Europe, there'll be relatively frictionless trade in goods. The big thing for the government will be services. We have a big deficit in goods. We have a fairly large, although smaller than the deficit in goods, surplus in services. That's basically what our entire economic model has been built on since Thatcher. Johnson will be prioritising with the US looking at services, and actually will be prioritising in his negotiations with all sorts of other parts of the world, services, particularly financial services. I mean, if we're thinking about financial services, China is a particularly important market because of, partly because of the close links between China, Hong Kong and the UK, purely premised on the fact of the existence of HSBC, but also London has been a very important market for China to internationalize the renminbi. So financial markets outside of Europe are a big concern, but also because European financial markets, European investment banking is doing badly at the moment. I mean, European investment banks are doing badly at the moment. And I can see a case for Johnson saying our biggest priority is to make sure we get a good agreement with the US on finance, insurance, professional services. And the things that he's going to have to give up to get that are going to be really big, especially if at the same time he's insisting we're going to maintain our digital services tax, which is going to screw over big US tech companies.
Which
and
Sadiq
we're going to
Khan is
let
against.
and we're going to let Huawei run our 5G, right? Like both massive red lines for America. At the moment, I imagine, Trump and Pompeo are looking at Johnson and thinking we need to give him a bit of slack. We need to tell them that everything's going to be fine so that they go and do their own thing. But ultimately, when it comes down to the hard line of actually negotiating this thing, they're not going to take any prisoners. And yeah, I mean, all this is obviously taking place in the context of the just, quite precipitous decline and collapse of the liberal world order when it comes to not just, trade, but also international investment. We're going through this period of globalization where international capital flows have shrunk dramatically compared to where they were before the financial crisis, and are only just kind of stabilizing at a lower level, where you're seeing lots of different measures of globalization start to shrink. And when you're seeing all the institutions that govern that process sink into deadlock, like the WTO, or collapse, like, what was going to be TTIP and the TPP, or break apart like the European Union. These are all massive structural transformations of the global economy that are taking place in the context, obviously, of changes in politics, but also much more fundamentally changes in the way that the world economy works. Those, as Warren would say, big structural trends are not going to change.
She says big structural change, doesn't she?
Yeah, whatever.
Big structural change isn't a great slogan, but big structural trends would be an even worse slogan if you run for president, I think. Is that what's going to happen then? We're gonna accept chlorinated chicken and higher drug prices in order to sell British financial products on Wall Street?
Pretty much, yeah. That's the direction of travel, for the reasons that Grace just eloquently stated there. The Americans are dead keen about this right now. They want fast turnover on these. One is, of course, for Donald Trump's re-election campaign. He too wants to be able to say that he has an oven-ready deal when he goes into his campaign mode. So he wants something.
Presumably it's irrelevant for their campaign mode, though. What American voter cares about a trade deal with Britain?
Oh, they care. It's very symbolic. And also for the big agriculture businesses, if they think that it's on the cusp of something, then they might turn out their pockets a lot more. So I
suppose for the lobby, potentially, in the US, which is obviously very powerful,
it's... Because it's not going to have a big effect on their economy, is it?
I was listening to a podcast the other day that had tried to do an econometric analysis of the impact of the Trump trade war with China on voting patterns in Republican swing states. They found a correlation,
And so it's going well. It's going well for Trump, the trade war.
No, that depending on whether or not you are a state that is more hit by the retaliatory tariffs or benefit from the imposed tariffs, there is an observable swing in voting patterns in the midterms. But that's economists being
with
weird.
the UK, with the election coming up, it's about pride. That Trump as the great deal maker can do one with the UK, and kind of like other entities like China and the EU are watching Trump sort of hoover in the UK, and that sense of kind of like rebuilding American hegemony there. But also importantly for the big business support from the agriculture sector and from the pharmaceutical sector, if they think that he is aggressively pursuing a deal which benefits them, then it's money in for him. And the reason why it's more lucrative than just the UK on the agriculture front is because it then becomes a beachhead into Europe in terms of their products sort of getting in, then forces more compromise from maybe a trade deal with the rest of the EU. And with the pharmaceutical prices, because the UK has the collective sort of bargaining of the nation state on those prices then often become a benchmark for a lot of other countries around the world. So if they can shift the benchmark, then they can push up prices elsewhere.
Interesting. So the relevance of Britain is beyond the British market. It's the fact that if our regulations change, that will have spillover effects
it's domino effects
markets.
elsewhere.
I'm not an expert on this particularly, but I had read exactly that, literally last week in a book, which was very good. It's called Privatized Planet. But that literally US pharmaceutical companies would attempt to use negotiations with the NHS to set the terms of any future negotiations predominantly with global south countries and say, if the UK is accepting these high prices, then you will as well.
Absolutely.
So defend NICE at all costs. What does NICE stand for?
National Institute of Clinical Excellence.
Excellence.
So they're the people who decide what drugs the NHS is
Okay,
going to buy and what price we can buy them for.
that's a slightly different issue there as well. The main prize that the US want to get from UK healthcare is basically decision making. And that's not just for drug prices, that's also what drugs are being used by the NHS. They used to call it death panels, that we would say we're not going to pay in order to bring in those because it doesn't have cost benefit for us. They want to have some decision-making power in that. They want their advisors to be able to come in. Similarly, what they want to do is they want to have more access to NHS data. So they'd very much like if we were outside GDPR and we were outside any protectiveness of our patients' data and NHS running data, and their tech companies could have a look at that data, work out how best to run a hospital or how best to diagnose a certain syndrome, and then with those algorithms that they develop from NHS data, patent those algorithms and come out, sell it back to the NHS. Yeah.
Wasn't there already a thing about US pharmaceutical companies getting access to NHS data before the election?
Yeah, it was with Amazon and
right. Okay.
Yeah, and Alexa.
Oh God, yeah.
And but this is a huge threat, because even if you pass anonymized data, it's very easy to get re-identification by lining up different databases is one thing. Then you can sell that on to insurance companies. But then also, even if you've got anonymized data, if you're building these algorithms that are then patentable and sellable, then essentially the really scary thing for me is that when we have decision making now about the NHS, it is in public hands. It's largely the charities, and the universities that give advice to government, and the NHS itself, has its own data. But if this is all shipped out in terms of the analysis and processing to big US tech companies that can analyze it in ways that we can't, they can make recommendations, and we don't understand how they got at those recommendations. And those recommendations could involve bringing in other companies that are their buddies and so forth and so on. And then who is talking in the politicians' ears then? It is not the public interest groups, and it's not the NHS themselves. It is the outside corporate entities that are very, very competent in the US at being a very powerful lobby there. And we've seen what happened in the US when they just run away with this system, and it costs everyone an arm and a leg. And you do not want to get those insurance middlemen coming into the system, and those providers coming into the system, locking up the market and not letting anything else in. That's the problem. You get those in, getting them out is nigh impossible.
Let's talk about post-Brexit Britain beyond trade for a moment. Then we're going to talk about the Labour leadership, which obviously is going to be fun, because I think you're probably backing different candidates, and obviously our audience loves gossiping about the Labour leadership. There's nothing like a race, is there? Like a political race. First of all, though, I want to talk about post-Brexit Britain. So a refrain of... By the way, we're drinking Bucks Fizz to celebrate Brexit today. I've forgotten what was the band won the Eurovision in 1981 with the song "Making Your Mind Up."
I'm not going to lie, that was before I was born, so I don't know what you're talking about.
When were you born, mate?
76.
Oh.
He's older than he looks.
Yeah, you look very good for your age.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Stop it, Michael, please.
Sorry, we were talking about the North. Well, we weren't yet, but we were about to.
Okay, that's what
we were about to talk about was what Remainers have said since 2016 is people didn't vote to get poorer. No, they didn't. And the counter to that would be that actually, if your reason for voting for Brexit was as a cry out for a reset of the British economy, then potentially it was a fairly rational thing to do, because what you have now is a Conservative Party who's saying they're going to invest tens of billions of pounds in the North. Treasury rules are being... This is, but you should wait for the quick. Treasury rules are being rewritten so that it should favour infrastructure outside of the southeast, because what they're saying is at the moment the Treasury decides on infrastructure projects based on what the return to them is, and that means that any project is going to be more profitable if you put it where people have higher incomes, and that favours the south,
particularly land values. Yeah.
So the Conservative Party or the government at this point, and the Labour Party competing with them, are focused on reindustrialising the north of England.
So they say.
Okay, why is it bullshit, Grace?
Do you want the short answer or the long answer?
Medium.
Short answer first, then if it's good, we'll ask for the long one.
Okay, well, the short... That's actually a very good way of doing it. Okay.
You can vote in the comments.
So the short answer is that Johnson, at the moment, has not signalled any intention to depart from the kind of Cameronian, Osbornian austerity agenda that he inherited. So he's said, we want all our departments to cut budgets by 5%. We are not, I think this is an attempt to kind of reassure financial markets that just because his electoral coalition has been reshaped, his priorities when it comes to the economy are not going to be reshaped. That's part of the long answer, which I'll come back to later. But just, purely on those basic terms, if he wants to stay within those boundaries, we're going to have lower rates of growth. than if we'd remained in the European Union just on the supply side, so on the potential capacity the economy can hold. In the short term, when it comes to just, demand from one year to the next, that's also going to be tighter. Potentially we see a small boost because there's a slight decrease in uncertainty, which means businesses that have been holding off investing for a while start to invest. Consumers maybe spend a little bit more. We've seen kind of, a flattening out in house prices, again, related to that uncertainty effect. But also we are, just purely based on the point we're in the economic cycle, looking towards a recession at some point in the next several years. That recession could be a coordinated global recession because you're also looking at similar sort of dynamics in the US and the Eurozone. And it might be accompanied by a kind of series of, to put it euphemistically, corrections in financial markets, particularly when it comes to corporate bonds in the US. And also, corporate debt in the UK is also particularly high. That's been responsible for a lot of insolvencies. I'm making the short answer the long answer. Basically, there's a lot of issues that we expect to hit the economy at some point in the next several years. If Johnson wants to abide by all of the, claims to fiscal responsibility that he has measured himself by through his entire political career, he will not be able to do that whilst also properly investing the amount that needs to be invested in the North in order to deal with the disparities that exist there. The other thing is that to make that investment stick, you would need to completely transform British political economy, because we've got an issue around the role of the City of London in terms of sucking in investment, human capital and financial capital from the rest of the world, which deprives the rest of the country of those things and has historically pushed up the value of our currency, making our exports less competitive. So shifting that model and saying, no, we want people, we want investment in different parts of the country, and also we don't want, huge amounts of money coming into the UK to buy up all our assets, is a massive transformation. If I've been interesting enough, the longer answer is basically about whether or not, and I think I was thinking about this when you were talking, which was, there has been on all sides of the political debate this post-materialist narrative that Labour, so as in the electoral politics, has become unmoored from material concerns.
And it's all about values.
Exactly. And what's been interesting is that it's been Remainers who have been adopting the most materialist position, like Brexit's going to harm you, so don't vote for it, right? Whereas, those on the right...
to us a power of good, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, those on the right, like the Matt Goodwins of this world who would say it's the Conservatives are going to go to the left on the economy and stay to the right on values, and that's going to be how they're going to win. And other people saying, Labour needs to stay to the left on the economy but go to the right on foreign policy. Triangulate as though they are unmoored from an electoral coalition, well, from basically a set of interests who they represent. And I would argue that both parties in the UK have emerged in order to represent a particular set of class interests in the UK. The Labour movement obviously the Labour Party emerges from the Labour movement. The Conservative Party flits between representing different sections of capital throughout its long history, but ends up from the 1980s onwards particularly representing international financial capital and the city, and has been responsible for the transformation of British political economy to make it very internationalised and very financialised, i.e. the type of economy that would not be able to abide, or which politically would not be able to abide dramatic increases in spending. That just comes back to why why the ruling class doesn't like interventionist states, even though if in the long term it is potentially in the interest of capital for those interventionist states to create more demand so that workers can buy more stuff and, whatever. And it's basically because it shifts power relations. And we are at it shifts power in society away from capital and towards labour, because you are absorbing the reserve army of labour, you're employing more people, and you're removing the threat of capital strike by investing more in the economy. And, we're at a point where that balance of power is in a state of flux. It is very, it's shifting. It's uncertain.
I mean, is it in a state of flux? Couldn't you argue from the right that ultimately, because Labour is so weak anyway, that you can throw a bit of money? I mean, Labour and not the party.
No, I know, but with
organised Labour is so weak, then you can afford to reflate the economy a bit, and it's probably not going to cost you in terms of political power.
We do what we're always doing here, which is focus on ourselves and not focus on the opposing side. If you look at capital, it is, if you look at just the nature of capitalism today, this is historically a Marxist critique of the way that capitalists understand themselves, but it's truer today than it ever has been, which is that capitals, individual businesses, and the broader kind of business and financial sector is more dependent on the state than it probably ever has been in history, right? Mm-hmm. That means that control over the state is more important than it ever has been in history. And it means that small swings in the balance of class power potentially create shifts in the dynamics of capitalism that create much bigger problems. So yes, we are weak. Days lost to industrial disputes have been the 6th lowest in 2018 than since records began, and I think it was like the 1850s, which is not good. But capital is also weak, and that means that we're in a moment of contingency. So yeah, we'll see.
We're going to segue from organised Labour to the Labour Party. Keir Starmer celebrated Brexit Day by giving a speech. He spoke about leave remain divides behind, but then went on to make an announcement that he would pledge to reinstate freedom of movement. So I'm going to read from a Dan Bloom tweet. He's a Daily Mirror. He's the Mirror, a journalist. He said in his speech, "We have to make the case for the benefits of migration, the benefits of free movement. I want people in this country to be able to work abroad in Europe and vice versa." And when Dan Bloom asked him to clarify whether this would mean bringing back freedom of movement, Starmer said, "Yes, of course, bring back, argue for, challenge." Jonathan Portes, who knows about this stuff, he's been on the show before, KCL economist, King's College London, used to be chief economist to the Cabinet, or the Cabinet Office, under Gordon Brown. He said that this announcement by Starmer, this really doesn't make any sense economically, legally, practically, unless the UK joins the EEA or the single market. To me, this seems like it's a bit strange in the same speech to say we're going to move beyond leave, remain divides, and then heavily imply that in the next general election, what you want to do is fight for Britain to rejoin the single market. Because if anything's going to reopen the leave, remain divides, it's saying we've done a harder Brexit, now let's revert to Brexit in name only.
Did he really know what he was saying? What do you think, Mike? Because I am honestly not convinced that he had any idea what he was actually implying when he said that.
I think that he was probably saying that because polls show that freedom of movement is still quite popular. When people are presented with freedom of movement as that reciprocal arrangement, which gives them also freedoms.
But is it that freedom of movement is popular, as in all Labour members obviously are pro-migration and want to defend that? Or is it specifically that freedom of movement as in being part of the European Union and therefore retaining that specific institutional arrangement that he seems to be implying will be retaining is something that Labour members want more than anything?
Not even retaining,
I think,
rejoining.
Yeah.
I think it's a play to the fact that the current immigration system being brought in is going to hurt. You're going to see Windrush-like things as people get rejected for bizarre reasons. And the reciprocal rights of freedom of movement or something like it is something that Norway subscribes to and Switzerland subscribes to. So you do think
that he was, in saying that, saying, I want to make a case for joining the Norway or an EEA or whatever?
I think that he wants to open up a potential pathway back, but one step at a time, and you can actually have free movement agreements in limited form. It starts visa-free travel with the other European countries. That encourages Remainers to think that, you're setting a course then to say, if you've got that, then you've also got services and some capital that can travel with it and so forth and so on. But the way we are at the moment is if we axe free movement, then we're the only country in Western or also Central Europe that doesn't subscribe to that. And that means that all the other countries, they have these rights for their citizens to move around and set up bank accounts and go and retire in different places. And we're going to be hitting barriers like that.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
people
obviously,
will feel that. And so I think that...
A very select few bunch of people will feel that, won't they?
Well, no, I mean...
Well, no, there's all
done.
the kids that want to work in other countries as well. So, I mean, And
then we don't know what's going to happen to EU citizens living here. And it's and also... Brits living in Europe, like it is, and I mean, I probably feel less sorry for them, but it is a
Why
ridiculous
is that?
set of reasons because
They're
people
not-
have moved to 6-year-olds who've moved to Alicante.
Okay, it's not always glamorous places, and sometimes it's because
I'm not
their
sure how
partners
glamorous
and
Alicante
families-
is, to be honest.
But you know what I mean. It's easy to dismiss them as expats, but actually there are a lot of people that do live elsewhere in Europe that are really stressed right now.
No, I'm
Because
100% sure
the very
that is true.
foundation of their working life or their retired life or their family life is based on these treaty agreements that they thought were for life.
I want to introduce some more context that I think makes this particular announcement, whether or not it was by accident, surprising by Keir Starmer. Because like Lisa Nandy, he's announced his support for freedom of movement only after Brexit has happened, or only after it's become
And this
incredibly
is the
clear that
other
Brexit's
thing.
going to happen. I'm just going to go to an article first from 2017. So this is an article in the Huffington Post from 2017, which was talking about the Clause 5 meeting, which is the meeting when the Labour Party decides what's going to be in its forthcoming manifesto, or upcoming manifesto. And in 2017, the feedback from that meeting was that Keir Starmer had managed to make the position tougher when it came to migration and freedom of movement. So the article reads, Shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer won agreement at the Clause 5 meeting of the party at which senior MPs and unions finalised a manifesto to make the policy on EU workers much clearer. Lines that freedom of movement will end and that Labour would oversee a new system were not opposed when raised by Starmer. One of those present said. Corbyn, for context, had sort of said earlier in the year that, maybe we'll keep freedom of movement, maybe we won't. Starmer 2 weeks before this meeting had said, no, freedom of movement will end. So we had then a position where, when staying in the single market was very much still on the table, you had
He was
Starmer
like,
taking a tough position on migration.
In
now
2017,
it's fairly
it was killed off very, very early.
Now it's fairly but the point is now it's fairly impossible to stay in the single market because we're going to leave. Freedom of movement is going to end. Suddenly, like Lisa Nandy, now he's in favour of freedom of movement.
Is it any surprise that he's a massive opportunist and is basically just using this issue for his own political gain? Like, absolutely not. And even if we can, have a debate about whether or not it's feasible to say that to abide by the specific institutional arrangements that underpin freedom of movement within the European Union, it's worth mounting a campaign to rejoin the EEA when Labour next gets into power. But if Starmer wins and adopts that position, he'll never get anywhere near power, so it doesn't matter. Like, he's just completely and utterly triangulating, and I would be deeply, deeply surprised if he didn't immediately drop this as soon as he's presented with the next Clause 5 meeting that he'll end up in, where he has to choose what position he's adopting on migration going into the next manifesto.
Mike, I know that you're more of a fan of Keir Starmer than Grace, so are you going to
It's not
defend
hard,
him
to
from
be
this
fair.
charge of opportunism?
No, and I think that the 2016 referendum concussed us in Labour as a party so much that lots of people were scrambling around trying to find their feet and came up with a whole bizarre set of different positions along the way.
Which in 2017 turned out to be correct. Sometimes you make better decisions when you're bamboozled than when you've got enough time to rationalise
and also
what you're seeing
and also
around you to pretend the world is how you'd like it to
yeah,
be.
you have to respond to where the electorate's at as well. So I think there's legs with the free movement argument. Certainly with Switzerland, when they voted against free movement, and they're outside the customs union.
Switzerland is a weird
and
country, by the way. I was there recently. Very weird country.
I used to live there.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, I mean, when I turned up there, so see, they subscribe to free movement. You have to register at your local canton when you arrive, okay? And you have to register within a week. And I was there for 1.5 weeks before I found out that everything was settled and I could stay there. So then I went to register, and they fined me for not having registering within a week. They fine you for everything. They will also send out
Creepy.
renewal things to immigrants over the Christmas period. It's like, you wonder if that's to catch them out. So yeah, anyway, Switzerland isn't a fun country, but
That
nevertheless,
is the model for Europe, like completely and utterly open to international capital and just like for people.
but they subscribed to free movement. And they voted against it back in, what was it, 2014? They voted against free movement and going back to an old quota system. And that ruptured all of their individual contracts with the EU because they're not actually part of the single market. They've just got this complete spaghetti network of contracts with the single market in order to sort of pseudo be in it. And it's got all these guillotine clauses associated with it, such as, for example, when Croatia or any new members join, then they have to sign that they have free movement with the new country coming in, and they refused to do that for Croatia because of the referendum they just had, and so that meant that they got axed out. Switzerland got axed out of the science program, for example, which was just setting up.
That's
because
the right
they hadn't signed
that we're fighting for, though, right?
Then what happened was after they were out of it for a year, then they renegotiated partial access while they were sorting things out internally. They decided to keep free movement, but they negotiated with the EU essentially that they could advertise jobs within the country or locally first, and if they couldn't be fulfilled locally, then they could be advertised externally. Yeah. I think that's actually a smart model. Because I'm all for
So what, you
localism.
only allow people to come in if they have a job offer?
Not quite. You say for any new jobs, they have to be advertised within the country first or within the region first.
But you can still have loads of people moving to then find a job.
You can, but the way free movement works is that essentially you've got 3 months of visa-free travel, after which, if you can sustain yourself financially, you can stay, or if you've got a job, then you can stay.
Oh, so if not, so even...
And this is something that we never properly used in this country, actually, because you can actually make that demand. You're not allowed to stay here beyond 3 months unless you can prove that you've got the finances in order to take care of yourself.
Why didn't Cameron just sort of
Horribly
promise
brutal,
to enforce that?
I've never known. I think part of the reason was because you need ID cards associated with that, and then people didn't want to go down the ID card route because we'd had that in previous years politically. So I don't know why that option wasn't fully explored, but it was nuts that it wasn't. Because they certainly do it in other countries. I mean, I know someone in Belgium, and her boyfriend, when she arrived, had to take her down to local officials' office and prove that he had enough finances to cover her, for her to be able to stay. So they do it in other European countries, and we just never had that very sensible discussion of how you adjust free movement within the free movement framework that we have.
But that's assuming the problem that we have in immigration was...
We're going to start taking some questions, so you can put them in the YouTube comments, or you can put them on Twitter with hashtag #TiskiSour. We prefer it when you do Twitter because it means that more people are guided to the show. Sorry, I'll let you finish that point. No,
I was just going to say that point, I mean, it assumes that the issues with immigration have anything to do with the number of immigrants in the country, which doesn't seem to be correct, just purely based upon the correlation between support for leaving the European Union / anti-migrant sentiment and the number / proportion of migrants that live in your area.
Is that so? I thought, again, this is a bit of a derive because I also haven't sort of updated my research on this, but I thought the case, what everyone was writing straight after the European referendum, was that actually the chances of voting for Brexit were related to the speed of change in your particular region. So if if it was a fairly monocultural, fairly white place, basically, and then you had a lot of Polish people or Eastern Europeans moving in, right, then you voted. I mean, it's too early. I'm not here to say that was the causal reason, but I think the correlation was that the rate of change in your region corred with a Brexit vote. So I don't think you can say it's completely alien from numbers.
But I mean, broadly, we don't have that much relative to our population inward migration, particularly over the last several years. We've had not very much at all, and American
immigration is rocketing compared to Europe or the UK.
Even like somewhere like Germany, much more as a proportion of the population.
But it's only here that it was tied to EU membership, because in those other countries,
because the European Union means something very different when it is your currency, it is your...
Well, also
you know,
in terms of didn't migration, I thought intra-EU migration in terms of people moving from Poland's a middle-income country, but sort of like people moving from a lower-income country to a higher-income country, I think that is more a thing that happened in Britain than, say, Germany.
I don't know.
I didn't.
Migration's
think so.
politicized in different ways in different countries.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say something else, but I can't remember what it was. I don't know why I said that out loud rather than in my head. Sorry, carry on.
Chris Jarvis, who also gave us a £5. Thank you.
Nice.
How does the left hold the
Legend.
Tories to account on Brexit implementation without falling into the trap of appearing to be trying to reverse Brexit? Good question.
Yeah.
What do you think, guys?
General strike. Sorry, I'm just like completely and utterly done with this bullshit around parliamentary procedure, as if it ever worked to actually hold the government to account using the mechanisms that Liberals claim are like the bulwark of our democratic system. It doesn't. We have one of the most powerful executives in the world. The government will do what the government wants to do, especially when, as a government like Johnson's, it has explicitly run on having no respect for Parliament or liberal institutional democracy, the separation of powers, whatever. Like, that is not going to work. If we want to resist this government, we have to resist this government. That means resisting it in our workplaces, resisting it on the streets, in communities. It means actually building a bottom-up grassroots movement that can shift the balance of forces.
Do you want to top up?
Yeah, sorry, I got quite angry then. Just because, yeah.
I mean, this is... I need to get closer to the microphone. This is exactly what we're thinking about now within the broad pro-European movement, because we see a lot of wreckage coming down the line for our NHS, for a lot of small businesses, for farmers, and for our standards. And so we're thinking, well, how do you actually oppose the government, which is all powerful? It doesn't just have an 80-seat majority, but doesn't have any opposition within the government itself, because they cleared all of that lot out.
Yeah.
They brought in some new people who've all signed contracts that they're wedded to the government's manifesto, and they're ruled absolutely and aggressively by Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and most importantly, Dominic Cummings, who, do not forget, decided to get police to pull in Sajid Javid's, the Chancellor's assistant or whatever role it was, have her marched into the office, had her sacked and taken off to the police station. Do you remember that incident?
No.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was a. They marched out. They called security on Sajid Javid's advisor.
Yeah.
I think because they thought potentially she was leaking.
Yeah.
I don't know if she was, but I think that was their.
But
it was Cummings being
no charges,
zero tolerance on.
It wasn't even zero tolerance. It was in order to control the Treasury.
I mean, I'd say in terms of a response to that, to bring back the Labour leadership, it's always a fun.
No charges were pressed against her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
it
what
was
the question?
absolutely to new to him and see how he responded.
Well, the question was about how do you hold the Tories to account when it comes to Brexit without looking like you're doing parliamentary wrangling?
I'm sorry, I still stick with my first answer. General strike.
My answer isn't necessarily general strike, but I think Labour should stop talking about Brexit. I think, given that you have no chance of really affecting it at this point because they have a majority of 80, what you should do is say, look, the Tories are doing Brexit. What we're doing is we're building support for our vision of Britain.
Yeah.
And then if things fuck up, you blame the Tories. You don't even blame Brexit. If there's a recession in the next 3 years, don't blame Brexit. Blame the Tories. It's the Tories who are in power. And this is why I think the whole Keir Starmer speech and why I'm worried about Keir Starmer is because while he talks about moving beyond Leave Remain divides, which I think is absolutely the correct position.
He will make Labour all about
there was a briefing recently. I mean, it's disputed what exactly happened, but what in the briefing in any case, Keir Starmer in a shadow cabinet meeting had suggested that they could oppose the Brexit bill unless there was a amendment which meant that if no new trade deal was reached by August this year or whatever, we'd have a 2-year extension of the transition period. It's just like, this isn't your problem anymore. Do you know what I mean?
No, 100%.
You're there. You're not there to stop
give the
government
legal advice as to whether or not it should do
you are there to fight for
whatever.
your vision of Britain, for you to
Yeah.
win an election in 5 years' time. And yes, hold the government to account because you might get some good stories out of it. But but you're not going to get any good stories out of it. Your job for the next 5 years is to find dirt on the Conservative Party. It's not to say, oh, we were right when it came to Brexit.
And I know, I was obviously being slightly facetious, but I do think that we will experience on the left something of a realignment away from what we've been doing recently, which is over-focusing on electoralism. And actually recognizing that a lot of the shit that we've ended up in has been because we have done the inverse of what we perhaps had in the relationship between the Labour Party and the Labour movement historically, which has overdeveloped the party political side of the left
totally.
and underdeveloped all the forces that sit below it. We have no real power within the Labour movement, and the Labour movement itself is still insufficiently linked to the rank and file. We have built something of a left movement and a set of interlinked social movements, a la the kind of multitude thesis that was so popular until recently. But it has yet to cohere into a really powerful social force that is going to be capable of resisting the kind of things we're going to need to resist. And I think that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah.
Sam D asks, can literally anything be done by the left, or for that matter, anyone, to block the US trade deal, especially drug prices and further NHS privatisation? I mean, that's a good excuse to get out on the streets, really, isn't it? And to have a populist campaign from the Labour Party, which isn't about fear-mongering about no deal. It's about saying that the government are in hock with corporate interests in the United States to sell out your rights. It's not like, the government are irresponsible, so we need to save them from themselves, which is the sort of has been the Labour line up to now.
But do we want to get out on the streets with this, or do we want an effective digital and social media campaign that targets the persuadables?
Presumably we want both, because we want that to get people out on the streets.
Quite. But not everyone looks at people marching in the streets, and I know this, having been
this from experience.
Yeah, but it
turns out 500,000 people in front of Parliament isn't a majority of the public.
you learn your lessons.
31st of January 2020.
I happily walk into this, because this is what Labour do, and we did as well. Show of strength. Helps get some issues forward, but there will be people who watch that on their TV screen and think, what's that got to do with me? All of that lot complaining.
Yeah.
However, if they're sitting on their computer and they're logging into their email, and the ads you see on the side of your email are getting them to think about a US-UK trade deal, or if you're on Mumsnet and you're thinking about, well, do we want milk from the US if it has higher somatic cell counts, which is basically pus, which is because there is more mistreatment allowed in the US of animals, and they have higher mastitis rates. And it's not an issue of choice when you go to the supermarket, because what about when you go to your greasy spoon
but also
and
you're
have
not
a cup of tea?
allowed to mark products differently, are you?
Even if you were, what about all the canteens, school canteens and work canteens? What about all the restaurants you go into? Then what about all the milk that gets into sauces and cheeses and things like that? Once it gets into the system, it's untraceable. That kind of thing you want out on Mumsnet. You also want out the stuff about chlorinated chicken and what that means in terms of animal welfare in the States, and say, do we want this undermining British farming and the standards that we've built up? And then you talk about what we can afford in the NHS, and do we want our drug prices pushed up so that British companies that work in finance can make more money for themselves, which they launder offshore. So we need to be making these arguments not just in placards in the streets, but actually thinking about being more advanced digitally than we have been in terms of targeting particular things that matter to different people. And also we have to think very bluntly about the fact that Labour has lost several elections on the trot now. And in order to win, we actually have to win over people that have voted Tory several times over. We need our new leader, whoever he or she is, actually to appeal to long-standing Conservative voters. We need to think about things very differently. And the US trade deal is actually one of those things whereby you have opportunities for outreach. Green issues, another area where you have opportunities for outreach, and social care and the NHS, and social care is a big one that the government's going to struggle with, are opportunities where you can reach that older demographic that we have ignored.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point in that. Looking at the vote in 2019, right, the Conservatives increased their vote share by 1.2 percentage points.
From a high.
From a high, yeah, but by not a massive amount, relatively speaking. Most of the other parties...
They've increased it in each
the right-
election,
Well,
each election
but
over the last 4.
Labour
Now that's terrifying.
lost, what was it, 8 percentage points?
Yep.
Every other
40
party
to 32.
broadly stayed the same. Labour didn't lose. Labour lost, some voters to Tories, some voters to the Lib Dems, a huge number of people to non-voting. What was our... Now, the overall rate, the decline in turnout wasn't massive because actually some people who hadn't voted in 2017 voted in 2019, although they disproportionately went to the Lib Dems or the Greens. But Labour lost a lot of people to non-voting. And the whole premise of Corbynism was that you expand the electorate by bringing in people who have been successively over the last however many electoral cycles pushed out of wanting to vote and wanting to engage in politics because they feel like their interests aren't represented.
Yep.
Now, there is obviously a case to be made that in particular, the geographic spread of the Labour vote needs to be dealt with, which means we can't just do the policy of we'll just focus on young people in the cities and whatever, completely abandon our northern heartlands because that's now our base. It just doesn't work in terms of geographic spread. So in that sense, we need to do better at appealing to older voters in different parts of the country. Often they'll own their own homes, which presents its own set of challenges to us. But yes, that is an issue. I don't think what we need to be thinking is we need to appeal to what we imagine to be a traditional conservative voter, i.e., basically gut our economic policy in order to build a new kind of class coalition that completely breaks with the attempt of what we were trying to build in 2017. No. Really, the thing we were trying to build in 2017, which is a coalition of working people, i.e. anyone who earns a wage, against a small number of people who are effectively so wealthy that they're able to live off the returns generated from their assets, plus a bunch of other people who just hate Jeremy Corbyn. That seems to me to be the only viable option for socialist parties, or even just left parties, anywhere in the global north after the financial crisis. So, we need to have a long, hard think about where our vote is in particular and how we balance it out.
But that is the trick, to map out all the different demographic groups and say which ones vote Tory, but that we can reach without compromising what we actually want to do for this country.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying, collapse to the middle and go full, Tony Blair and offer, more internal market of the NHS. No. What was actually found in 2017.
What about promising not to speak to the Sun during a leadership election, but speaking to them after it?
What was that?
That's another Keir Starmer triangulation.
Oh, wait, what? Oh, God,
Keir
yeah.
Starmer,
Oh, yeah!
2 weeks ago. My problem with Keir is less compromise, because I'm fine with a few compromises.
Yeah.
I'm a bit soft left, as you always say. But the whole flip floppy thing, where 2 weeks ago in the hustings, he said, and I can say to you here in Liverpool, I will not be speaking to the Sun. And then in that same day in the afternoon, Aisha Hazarika asked him, but don't you think it might be useful to speak to Sun readers to win an election? He was like, after the leadership election.
No. All right. I didn't know that. Okay.
You're changing your mind now.
He just...
That does influence my opinion somewhat,
which is similar to the freedom of movement thing. It's like when it matters, no, let's get rid of it. Now it doesn't matter. Let's keep it.
Even if you were just doing things based on an attempt to triangulate, you would not deliberately appear that inauthentic. That's what everyone hates more than anything right now in their politicians. Yeah. You would at least try and have some substance.
Newsflash, Boris Johnson just won the last election.
Yeah, but he has the kind of emotional and existential substance that appeals to people on an emotional level.
Well, he's spent a lifetime as a politician communicating with people. Keir Starmer spent a lifetime winning legal arguments.
It's a similarity between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
They can lie their asses off, but a lot of people still regard them as truth tellers.
Because they think they're authentic even if they lie.
Exactly.
That is the problem. Starmer can seem completely inauthentic.
Yes. And that's the problem between the Cameron, Blair and, if Starmer, if you want to throw it in, type of politician that looks like they're always being careful, but they never actually tell a lie, between those that lie all over the place, and people think they're truth tellers because they say whatever they think. Yeah,
because they're breaking the rules. So when Donald Trump and Boris Johnson lie, they're breaking the rules because they're not following what is supposed to be correct
They're
political
following
etiquette.
their hearts,
When
their-
Keir Starmer
yeah.
And
says
then they're just putting all away. If they think it, they'll say it. If they think
Yeah,
they'll
yeah,
say it.
yeah.
And that's how you can trust them
Yeah.
because you know exactly what they think.
Yeah.
They're not gaming you. Yeah.
when Keir Starmer says to Labour members, I won't speak to the Sun, and then says to the public, I will speak to the Sun, that's not breaking political etiquette. That is following political
Yeah,
etiquette, and
exactly.
that's the difference. Anyway, Keir
Basically.
Starmer, come on the show. We want to have these conversations live in person. Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks
Mike
for having
Galsworthy,
me.
thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
See you on the other side of Brexit. Next time Tisky Sour goes live, we will be outside the European Union.
Kind of.
Nothing would have changed. But there you go. See you next
We'll be
time.
in the waiting
Good
room.
night.
Yeah.